Hello everyone, how's it going? So, I am now going to do the For Men Only review, which is written by Shanti and Jeff Feldhahn, and it is primarily narrated, it's entirely narrated through Jeff's point of view, being For Men. And this is sort of a follow-up book to the success that For Women Only had, which Shanti mainly narrated and produced. So, how I'm going to do this review is I have a list of notes that I considered highlights in the book. I'm going to try and go over these quickly because I have a lot written down. I'm going to probably give a couple of my thoughts on each single one, but I'm going to keep it kind of short. And then I'm going to give like my actual thoughts and what I've taken away from it once I've gone through everything. So, one thing that a lot of men in their recording for this book have explained their wife is feeling like a bog or a swamp where it feels like you're going to eventually get caught in quicksand and you're not going to be able to pull yourself out. So you just sort of like sit there and let things happen. That's how a lot of guys feel about their their relationship with their wife, and they just feel like there's not a single thing they can do about it. I wouldn't personally know, but I could see it happening. One of the immediate misconceptions that the book touches on is the idea of what marriage actually means to a man and a woman. So for a man, typically it means that you bagged you did everything correct and you were able to bag the deal of becoming married. But to a woman, it's not really that at all. That desire that a lot of men will make their wife in the future feel comes from how they chase after their girlfriend or whatever it is, and it makes them feel loved. It makes them feel like they're worthy. And when you sort of just stop doing that once you get married, that leaves a big discrepancy emotionally between a husband and a wife. A little bit later on in the book, it starts talking about how women are constantly worrying about the current health of their relationship. And this book, I should mention, is mostly focused towards married couples or boyfriend and girlfriends, but it is the general idea of it is able to be connected to just generally on a wiring level, something that is useful to know no matter who you're trying to compare it to that is of the opposite gender. But what it does also is with this comparison of how they're always worrying about the relationship with their man is like that feeling you get when you're uncertain of what your boss thinks of you at work. You start worrying about it constantly and excessively, even if there's nothing really wrong. So I can definitely make that connection in my brain, so that makes a lot of sense to me at least. Another thing is that there is a difference for a woman between knowing that she's loved and feeling loved. Essentially, when it comes to feeling loved, it's something that isn't it's always going to be this underlying insecurity that isn't ever going to like truly leave her. It's something that men have to reaffirm their wives on essentially on a daily basis. There will always be this nagging part of them that makes them wonder if they're worth it. Now, this particular part is talking about those times where it feels like she's upset at you or reclusive, and and what it describes it as is that what makes her feel loved is essentially your actions of showing that you're willing to go after her. Pursuing her makes her feel worthy in your eyes, in her eyes, excuse me. So this portion of the book was just simply talking about like when it comes to your wife, saying whatever like it's fine, for example, to actually just sort of gently pursue them until they finally let up a little bit because and this comes up a couple times in the book. The reason that they don't make it easier or more straightforward for their husbands or whatever it is a combination of things, but one of the biggest things is that it wouldn't mean that much if they didn't figure it out themselves. Another thing as well is that her talking about y'all's current relationship, it talks about how when she brings up something in the relationship, that doesn't mean that she's just attacking you or something. It's that she wants to kind of talk it out and try and make it better. Whereas for a lot of guys, it feels like she's just simply criticizing you for not doing enough. The next section is talking about how women's brains are wired differently. The book will make a comparison to how a woman's brain is similar to a setup in a computer quite a bit, not just a generally like how computers work, but what I mean is, so imagine you have one computer that is like a male's brain and one that's like a woman's brain. A man's brain is able to compartmentalize information and do it sequentially how they want to. Whereas because of women's wiring, they don't have that ability. So while women are able to multitask extremely well naturally, they don't really have the ability to just sort of like turn something off and come back to it in 15 minutes, for example. Instead, they're getting they have all these like tabs open, right? Tabs, and they're getting like sometimes they get these annoying pop-ups, and these could be like past emotional uh things that were negative to them, or and it explains also why women will just randomly bring up things that just seem completely unrelated to any form of conversation you're having or whatever you're doing. uh, but their brain is like this some supercomputer that's just doing all these things at one time, and it's like they just can't handle these pop-ups sometimes on their own. A part of the book, it explains it very simply. I seriously doubt and pretty much know that it's not using like the official terms, but in the brain there's like these two matters. There's white matter and gray matter, and the white matter is made for speed and processing quickly, whereas gray matter is for processing at a slower but more refined level. And essentially, women have more of the white matter and males have more of the gray matter in their brain. Also, it makes a comparison for men in terms of like these pop-ups, because when we're referring to it for women, like I said before, it's probably talking about things like why she'll just randomly switch uh, conversation on a dime, while she'll just randomly bring up like some past emotional thing that happened for her between a friend or a family member. Um, but for men, we're a lot of men are very visual creatures, and so it just makes that little descriptor to like we experience sort of a similar thing just through a different lens. Going further into the pop-up section, it gives an example of Jeff going over to Bob and Dana's house one time, and they have kids, and so they were playing in like their room, right? But there was a fire starter that got left in their room, and essentially Dana was saying like, we should go get it, and Bob was saying like they would never have the strength to actually light it, much less figure out how it works. And even though she knew that he was technically right, emotionally that pop-up she could not get rid of, and it was sort of it was like really bugging her, and it wasn't allowing her to enjoy supper, which is why Jeff went over there. But not too much longer after, uh, Jeff is talking about some of his findings in their research on how women's brains work, and he starts talking about how pop-ups is a different thing for women, and she's like, exactly. So she goes and turns it off, and I think she audibly says like, now I can enjoy supper. Another thing too is that it's your job as like a husband or a boyfriend to help close these pop-ups, especially when it's something involving like a negative experience in their past or whatever it is. Um, it's sort of it is talked about how, you know if we're to help close these annoying pop-ups for a woman, like we have to be there for her, and we have to legitimately try to help her through it whenever it's happening, because even though it doesn't make sense for someone like me as to why they can't just stop thinking about it, that's literally just how their brain works. Like it just they aren't able to just drag the mouse over and exit out. Another thing I wrote down is that there's this entire section of the book going over that there's often a good reason for what we consider random, and we're just not thinking about it hard enough. Uh, it gives an example of this husband and wife that are going on a dinner date, and they haven't talked for like 2 weeks, and he takes out about an hour before they get to the restaurant to go talk to his friend and his wife work on the same project, and he has that information that she actually wanted to tell him spoiled. And they essentially, what was supposed to be a really nice fun night to catch up on, ended with them just going to bed, like not even wanting to talk to each other. And even though it seemed random that like she got as upset as she did, when you hear her reasoning, it makes perfect sense. They haven't talked in a while, and she really wanted to break the new breakthroughs with her job and her project through. But him not prioritizing her over going to their friends really quick not only ruined that surprise, but it also felt made her feel like she wasn't quite as important. Another pretty important section of the book is comparing security financially versus emotionally. And the official name of this chapter is "The Issue is Closer to Home." And essentially what it's talking about is there's this interesting like table of data, and it says that about 70% of women would rather endure financial hardships over being distant from their man. And it's kind of like a relief, honestly, because I mean, if what you want to do in life is something that doesn't pay the bills as well as, say, a more high grossing job, but is also more stressful or more tedious, something like that. I mean, yes, there are going to be women out there that are more superficial, and women that aren't superficial, of course, are, everyone wants more money, like, of course, that isn't a bad thing, but a large majority would take that over the alternative of feeling like they never get to be close to their husband. Also, another thing as well is that listening probably means something pretty different to men than it does women. To men, it usually means like the literal words that are coming out of your mouth and understanding what those words are. Whereas when women want to be heard, they're talking about having their feelings understood. Oftentimes when a woman is like saying this, that, and the other about what has upset them, they're not looking for an answer. They're able to find the answer themselves, and they might already have it. But what they're really looking for is that they're looking for someone to be able to connect their emotions with. And so, what this equates to is kind of going back to something I said earlier in the review, is that like, why don't they make it more obvious? Well, the reason is because mainly is because it doesn't feel like it's earned. But also, there's a small section talking about how we taught them to be that way, in terms of us getting snappy when they mention anything about like the relationship or them being upset about something. So there is that. So we just need to be attentive about something like that. Continuing on with this, the most it starts giving like advice on how to compose yourself better. And it says when it first comes to when she's voicing distress like this, first ignore the problem and solely focus on her and her feelings. That way she feels like she is the priority and she's being heard, because that's what you're doing. And then after that, then perhaps start stepping into like fixing the actual issue, because many of us guys are like Mr. Fix It, we hear the issue and we're just like off to try and go fix it. Um, but when it comes to your wife or your girlfriend, it works differently. That is second to figuring out and really understanding what's bothering her and making her feel better about it. Another thing it briefly mentions is that uh, unlike women, men have sort of like a limit to how much like emotional talking about and anything really that they can take at one time. Uh, I can attest to this. When I have to talk about emotional stuff for too long, like I just sort of shut down, and that's what the book describes it as. Is like, even if men don't want to, when they are like talking about emotional stuff for too long, like their brain just like literally like tunes out, and they just like can't stop it. So beforehand, it's important to make a distinction that like you just can't simply listen and talk about this sort of stuff for like 3 hours straight. Not that you ever should, really, or hopefully not, because something that bad didn't happen, but, you know, that's an important boundary to set. Now, I don't necessarily want to go over the chapter focusing on sex, but I mean, it's a review. I need to go through it, so here we go. Usually, when she doesn't want sex, it has less to do with you and how much she loves you, uh, and more to do with like her personal like exhaustion, her how tired she is, feeling like she got the question on like to roll in the hay, you know, just like too soon, like too surprising, So there's a lot of stages to this chapter, talking about like give her warm up time, let her know or poke at the idea of doing it like a couple hours from when you mention it. Uh, and also the section about helping her close her pop-ups. For men, sex is sort of like a release from daily life, whereas it's not that at all for women. Like, it's extremely easy for them to become distracted, especially by those emotional pop-ups, whereas like men use that to like sort of get away from all that. So it's not the same. If you have that sort of emotional connection with her, you're gonna be more well off in that category. And yeah, so in terms of like the attractiveness between men and women, uh, even if you're a good-looking guy, um, your girl probably is never going to get the hots over you just because of how you look. That's extremely unlikely for a woman. A lot of it comes down to how she feels secure wise with her emotions, stuff that's already been mentioned before in the chapter, in the book, excuse me. And essentially, you can be, some strapping, good looking guy, but like that's not just gonna make her want to do the hanky panky uh, like it does for guys. They're not visual creatures like that generally, and they're certainly mostly not visual over emotional. So this part of the chapter compares, like, sort of brings back a memory for Jeff of like his daughter dancing in like a pink skirt when she was like 5 years old, being like, "Look at me, daddy," as she's like dancing around the living room. And in your fully matured, uh, adult girlfriend or wife, there is still a small side of them that is a little girl that wants to know that she's pretty and beautiful. And so when essentially think about it like this, like, when was the last time you told your girl that, like, she looked really good or something on those lines? Like, we generally just don't even think about it that much. I imagine that I wouldn't think about it that much either, because I mean, even though I haven't been in something like that, like, just knowing who I am as a person, like, I would probably do something like that too, where it's like I just don't ever mention it really. And it doesn't really matter how secure she is. Even the most secure women still need to hear and feel that they're wanted, needed, and they are beautiful. It's just an emotional thing that it doesn't really matter how independent of a person you are. You still, you, a woman still needs to hear it. And the final chapter is called The Mirror and the Hammer. Essentially, it's saying that us men are the best mirror that a woman can look through to affirm what she needs emotionally. But when we are sort of like looking at other women too much, or pornography, for example, we take a hammer and we smash that mirror, because now she knows that there are temptations and things that you desire that she just does not fill. But the actual last chapter is talking about how much women appreciate and love their man, being this sort of like nice send off to the book, and making average guys realize that even though they are an average guy, they're still the hero to their significant other. And with all that out of the way, this was a really important book for me to read. Uh, I would have never come to so many of these conclusions without reading this book. I will be reading again, and I'll, on my own time, be reading For Women Only just to see what it says. But I just think that, like, even though I'm not in a relationship with anyone, just knowing how women function in comparison to how my brain works has been a huge deal in terms of understanding that, like, I need to be more attentive and listen. Really, one of the most powerful things that I think a lot of people have but don't ever exercise is their ability to listen. And this book has made me realize that I'm very thankful that I sort of already started trying to exercise that some, because it's extremely important for understanding the opposite gender. And at least for me, like, I think that's for everyone, but not to say everyone, because there's always weird you know there's always weird situations. But yeah, it's also just helped me understand, like, my personal family a lot more. I live in a house, just, three girls essentially, my sisters and my mom. So it has helped me a load in terms of understanding them a lot more, and has sort of opened my eyes to what I do that sort of makes them makes them not like me as much. So, no, I think this is an extremely important book to read, and it's a really good gateway book, I would say, into the the science behind the difference between the different genders. This isn't a very scientific book. Like, it's not going to be, like, overwhelming you with these with scientific terminology that most people aren't going to understand. This book is specifically made to be able to be read by essentially anyone. So it's just a very easy read. Um, it's probably not going to be that easy if there's things in it you don't want to hear, but it's extremely important, and it is a gateway book to more complicated literature about the differences between different genders. So I'm going to rate this book. I'm going to rate it a very good out of 10 and important out of 10. All right, well, I sort of put that review off for a little too long, and I've said that a couple times now, but I what happened was is I read the book in like a week after my last review, and then I just didn't do the review for months, and then I read it again, and then I didn't do the review for 2 weeks, and now here we are. So I got like half of the battle down in terms of doing these in a timely manner. Now I just got to do the reviews. So yeah, I'm not certain which book I'll do next, so it'll be a little bit of a surprise for me and my audience, but we'll see. Thank you guys for watching, and have a nice one.